So thus far in our Chapter 5, we've been talking about how things go into and out of cells. Another important part of understanding how cells work is understanding how they use energy. So welcome to this presentation on energy and the cell. So any discussion of energy in the cell would be remiss if we didn't define what energy is in the first place. It's the capacity to do work, the ability to do work. So what's work? Well, work is when you take a force and apply it over a distance. If I push against the wall of the classroom, I'm not doing any work because even though I'm applying a force to the wall's not moving. I'm not applying enough of a force. If I were to push a book off of a desk, well then I was doing work. And the ability to do that is energy. Now energy comes in lots of different forms. One of the main differences is between kinetic energy and potential energy. Kinetic energy is the energy of motion. Potential energy, on the other hand, is energy of position or location, or in the case of chemistry and biology, it could be the structure of the chemical bonds of a molecule. Take, for instance, this picture of two bicyclists. The one on the left is sitting at the top of a mountain. Hopefully he's not going to go over that cliff. The one on the right is zooming down a street that's quite steep. So which one has potential energy and which one is demonstrating kinetic energy? If you said the one on the left has potential energy, you would be right. Because of the force of gravity, this bike could easily go rolling off of this mountain. But at the moment it's not. And so the potential for movement, the potential for motion energy is there. But there is energy stored in the position of the bike at the top of the mountain. The picture on the right is an example of kinetic energy. The bike racer racing down the mountain, tires spinning, is definitely energy of motion. So this brings us to the first law of thermodynamics. This states that the energy in the universe is constant. All the energy on our planet, all the energy in our universe is not changing. There's a finite or limited amount of it. However, energy can be changed, transferred, transformed from one type to another. Just the way our perilous biker sitting on top of the cliff could decide to ride over the cliff. If he did, the potential energy stored in the bike from its position at the top of the cliff could be transformed into kinetic energy as he careens down it. This is known as the law of conservation of energy. Because no energy was created, nor was it destroyed, energy could just be changed from one form into another. Let's see how this plays out in some scenarios in our everyday lives. So take a look at this car example on the top. On the left of the chart you see fuel. In the case of the car there's gasoline, and we combine the gasoline with oxygen. Notice that the gasoline has potential energy in the form of chemical bonds. At the top, the gasoline picture shows these black spheres that are carbon atoms and the white spheres that are hydrogen atoms, and they're all bonded together, and each one of those chemical bonds contains energy stored in the bond. When we mix the gasoline with the oxygen, those bonds begin to break, releasing the chemical energy into the car. And that chemical energy is transformed into different types of energy. First, it's transferred into kinetic energy, which allows the car to move and the tires to roll. You also know that if you've ever put your hand on the hood of a car after it's been running, it's warm. Some of the byproducts of that energy transformation are heat energy, which is released to the car and then to the environment. Notice on the right side of the chart there is a column called waste products. That's because just like with energy, matter cannot be created nor destroyed. It just gets moved around or changed. The waste products of this combustion reaction in a car are carbon dioxide gas and water molecules. Notice that both of these molecules have less chemical bonds than the gasoline does. That is because there is not as much energy stored in the bonds of these molecules as there was in the gasoline. That energy went into the kinetic energy of moving the car and the heat energy in the car. It's not contained between the chemical bonds any longer. The same thing can be said for energy conversions in a cell in the bottom row of the chart. Glucose is our fuel, and look at all the chemical bonds that exist between all the atoms there. Likewise, when it combines with oxygen inside of a cell, it produces different types of energy. One of those is called ATP. You learned this week that ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and it's the energy currency of our cells. We need ATP to do everything. But also, whenever we break down glucose, some of the energy in the chemical bonds of glucose is turned loose as heat. And that heat warms our bodies, but it's also radiated away from our bodies into the atmosphere, where we can't use it. Just like in our car example, our waste products are carbon dioxide and water as well. And just like in the car example, those chemicals don't have the same number of chemical bonds as glucose, our fuel, signifying that some of the energy in those bonds has gone to do other things. So this brings us to the second law of thermodynamics. And this law says that whenever you have energy being transferred from one type to another, as in our car example where we transferred the chemical energy from the fuel, the gasoline, into kinetic energy of motion for the car, there's always going to be some energy that escapes the system, if you will. Usually this is heat, like in the car example. This heat is a disordered form of energy. It's still energy, but no matter how much heat the gasoline produces, it's not going to make the car go any faster. This is energy that is essentially lost. We call that entropy. It's a measure of the disorder or the randomness or the loss of energy in our system. And so that law of energy, or the second law of thermodynamics, states that every energy transformation increases the entropy of the universe. We can't do anything about it. This happens in our cells as well. We eat food, and some of that food is used to make ATP energy, but some of it is lost as heat. We might hold that heat temporarily for a while, but it's eventually going to dissipate into our air around us and into our environments, and it's not going to help us run or kick a soccer ball or have a pretty good thought. So let's recap. Energy is the ability to do work, and it comes in a variety of forms. Two of those forms are potential energy, energy of position or structure or location, and kinetic energy, the energy of motion. And we've learned that energy can be transformed from one type to another, and whenever that happens, some of the energy is not going to be able to be useful to do the work that we need to done, whether we're talking about a car or our own bodies. So here is a good point to pause and look at the fact that energy in chemical reactions can occur in a couple of different ways. We need to go back and review some of the things that we learned way back in Chapter 2. First, whenever chemical bonds are formed, energy is absorbed. That's important to know. Chemical bonds forming absorb energy and store energy. Chemical bonds that break release energy. So sometimes long processes in our bodies involve forming and breaking chemical bonds. But in the end, when we sum up everything, if more bonds have been formed, energy will be stored, and if more bonds are broken, energy will be released. To understand how this works, let's take a look at a couple of reactions to see how some of those things play out differently. There are some reactions in the world that release energy, and a lot of these reactions usually occur spontaneously. One example is the reaction when you mix potassium permanganate, that's what that formula there means, KMNO4, is called potassium permanganate, and glycerin together. Pause the video for a second and go to YouTube and type in this link to watch the reaction between potassium permanganate and glycerin. Quite a flame from that chemical reaction. There's so much energy released that the dish actually hops and cracks if you were watching carefully. This is an example of an exergonic or energy releasing reaction. The potassium permanganate and the glycerin are both reactants in this chemical reaction. They're the two substances that we brought together at the beginning. The chemical bonds of the potassium permanganate and the glycerin contain energy, potential energy, stored in the chemical bonds. But when they're combined, the bonds of the atoms rearrange, and as they rearrange, new bonds form. These new bonds, though, have less energy in them than the original bonds, much the way the bonds of gasoline and oxygen rearrange in the engine of a car. The energy that is not stored in the chemical bonds, then, is released, and in this case it's released in the form of light and heat in the flame. The products, the resulting chemicals that are left behind after the potassium permanganate and the glycerin react, are less energetic than the chemicals we started with. There is an energy amount that's been released, and that's why this reaction is called an exergonic or energy releasing reaction. Other chemical reactions absorb energy and will not occur unless a source of energy is actually provided to the two reactants. Take a look at this video here, where it shows a reaction between two chemicals that, when combined, actually absorb energy from the air, from the environment. You can tell this because in the video they periodically show a heat gun, and the heat gun basically is a way of measuring temperature remotely. Make sure you take a note of the big numbers on the heat gun as they're measuring the temperature in degrees Celsius. Pause the video and take a look at the link here on YouTube, and then come back. This chemical reaction is an example of an endergonic or energy absorbing chemical reaction. In this case, the two reactants were at room temperature, but when mixed together, they needed energy from the surrounding environment in order to make them react. Now, these two reactants didn't need too much to get them to react in the first place. We did not have to add the heat purposely, like heating them up over a stove, for instance. But you could see that they did indeed absorb heat from the environment, because in the end they were much colder, and they had even frozen the water on the board so that the beaker was then frozen to the piece of wood. Energy in these types of reactions must be added from some other source, and as a result, the products, the resulting chemicals, have more energy stored in their chemical bonds than they originally had. Once again, this is called an endergonic or energy absorbing chemical reaction. In reality, in living things, exergonic and endergonic reactions rarely occur in isolation. They usually occur together in a series of chemical reactions that will sometimes absorb energy and sometimes release energy. The total of an organism's chemical reactions is called metabolism, and a metabolic pathway is a series of these chemical reactions, some exergonic and some endergonic, that either build up a molecule, in the case of an anabolic metabolic pathway, or break down complex molecules in a catabolic pathway. Let's take a look at a couple of these pathways in living things. First, let's return to the example of cellular respiration from earlier in the presentation. We know that we start with glucose and oxygen, and we break the glucose down to make ATP and release heat, and in the end we end up with carbon dioxide and water. So this is a pathway that involves taking a larger molecule, breaking it down into smaller molecules, and releasing heat and chemical energy in the process. Do you think that cellular respiration is an anabolic pathway or a catabolic pathway? Remember that anabolic build molecules and catabolic break them down. If you said this was a catabolic pathway, you're correct. We start with a large glucose molecule, and by a series of chemical reactions, not just one big reaction, we break glucose down little by little, chemical bond by chemical bond, until it becomes the carbon dioxide and water molecules that are waste products, in the process releasing energy all along the way. There are a series of reactions in this process that simply change the molecule around, and others that break it down into smaller pieces, but overall the pathway is catabolic. This picture shows a chemical reaction, or really the summary chemical reaction for a process of photosynthesis. Many of you may have seen this equation before and be familiar with it. In the process of photosynthesis overall, we take 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, combine them with 12 molecules of water, and light energy, and we use that to create glucose, whose chemical formula is C6H12O6, and 6 molecules of oxygen and 6 molecules of water are byproducts of this chemical reaction. In the end, we're taking light energy and putting it into the carbon dioxide and water molecules to make them energetic enough to build glucose, which plants can use for both energy as well as to build their biomass. So, considering what you know about this chemical reaction from that explanation, do you think that this is an anabolic molecule building or catabolic molecule breaking down type of pathway? If you said that the process of photosynthesis was anabolic, you would correct. In reality and nature, photosynthesis and cellular respiration are considered coupled metabolic pathways. Photosynthesis is an anabolic pathway. It's also an endergonic or energy absorbing pathway because light energy is absorbed in order to build the glucose molecules in photosynthesis. It's then coupled with cellular respiration, which is an exergonic or catabolic process. It is exergonic because it releases energy, and it's catabolic because it breaks molecules down. Notice in the green box, there are molecules, compounds, that seem to be recycling between photosynthesis and cell respiration. In nature, matter, atoms, are recycled. However, in nature, energy is not recycled because it's always changing into forms that are no longer recyclable. Remember that idea of entropy. The energy that we get out of the glucose molecules from cell respiration is used to form ATP, and a lot of that energy is released as heat. That heat energy can't go back into the process of photosynthesis like light energy can. That's why life on Earth depends on the sun and a constant supply of high-quality light energy to continue to fuel the exergonic and endergonic processes, the coupled metabolic pathways of photosynthesis and cell respiration on our planet. In essence, what enables life on our planet is this molecule called ATP. ATP enables life on the planet because it enables living things to temporarily store the energy from exergonic processes of cell respiration so that it can then again be released for other processes that require energy that are endergonic. It is the link between exergonic cell respiration and endergonic processes in living things. ATP consists of 3 parts. First, it consists of adenine, a nitrogen-containing molecule that is then connected to ribose, which is a sugar. Those 2 parts are going to look very similar to nucleotides that we learned about. The ribose is then connected to 3 phosphate groups. If you remember, in nucleotides there was only 1 phosphate group attached to the ribose, but in ATP there are 3. In ATP, the 3 phosphate groups are really the critical part that we want to focus on when it comes to understanding how energy is stored and released in our cells. Each of the chemical bonds between the phosphate groups is a very high energy bond that stores lots of energy. If we have made a molecule of ATP in our bodies, we can obtain some of the energy that's stored in it by hydrolyzing it. As you remember, hydrolysis is that process by which you add water to make a molecule break apart. So if we add water to ATP, we can hydrolyze it to ADP plus an inorganic phosphate group that's now by itself, plus a certain amount of energy. In this case, 7.3 kilocalories, that's calorie with a big C, per mole of ATP. A mole of ATP is equivalent to about 6 times 10 to the 23rd molecules of it. And that sounds like a lot, but we go through that very, very quickly in our bodies. This process is exergonic, right? Because we're releasing energy when we break the bonds. So the chemical reaction between water and ATP produces energy, therefore it's exergonic. One of the great things about ATP is that it's recyclable. It's like a rechargeable battery. When the energy in the phosphate groups is used up, it can be replaced so that we don't have to build ATP all over again from individual atoms. All we have to do is put a phosphate group back onto the ADP where it came off. So when we take a phosphate group and add it back onto ADP, we have to add energy to restore that chemical bond. We can get that energy from the food that we eat, and this can be done in our cells, most notably in various parts of the cytoplasm or in some of our organelles. So when we do that, we say that we have phosphorylated ATP. Process is called phosphorylation. It sounds like a long word, but it really just means to add a phosphate to something. And that process is endergonic because you're adding energy into the molecule and then storing it in a chemical bond. This energy can come from food, it can be in the form of chemical energy, and it's stored in the potential chemical bond that's there. ATP is involved in a lot of chemical reactions. It can be used for chemical work to make reactants combine to form products. It can be used in mechanical work to make proteins move and allows our muscles to work and other chemicals to move about our bodies. It can be used for transport work, as you saw in the sodium-potassium pump earlier this week. The phosphate group that sticks onto the channel protein allows for sodium and potassium to be transported across the plasma membrane. So these are just a couple examples of how we use ATP in our cells on a regular basis. So let's recap again. We learned that there are different types of metabolic pathways by which organisms use to build or take down molecules that enter into their cells. Some of these metabolic pathways can build molecules and be anabolic pathways. Some of these pathways can take down molecules or break them apart, and we call them catabolic pathways. We also looked at chemical reactions or these metabolic pathways from the way in which energy is exchanged throughout the chemical reactions. So for instance, some pathways can be energy absorbing so that the products will have more energy than the reactants. Others can be exergonic, in which the products have less energy than the reactants because energy is released from those chemicals. The two graphs you see here are of the course of the reaction compared to the amount of energy that the substances in the reaction have. And you'll notice that in the endergonic reaction, the products have more energy at the end than the reactant started with. The line is higher on the graph on the energy axis. In the exergonic reaction, the energy starts at some point, and the products at the very end of the reaction have less energy. But notice that in both cases, the line goes up from the reactants. The line doesn't come down as far for the endergonic reaction, and the line comes down even further than the reactants in the exergonic reaction. But that doesn't negate the fact that in both of these reactions, the line goes up at first. And that's because most chemical reactions require some kind of activation energy. Some energy has to be added to the system before the reactants will react. Otherwise, things all over the world would be reacting with each other and exploding and blowing up and turning into heat clouds and so forth. And our bodies would be falling apart as things randomly bumped into each other that would like to react. It's kind of good that things don't react on their own, that they need a little energy to get them started. This activation energy is the minimum amount of energy required to start a chemical reaction. Now make no mistake, some reactions have a very low activation energy, like the example we saw in this particular case where we added the two chemicals together and they got very cold. We didn't need much to get that to happen. However, some reactions in our bodies take an enormous amount of activation energy to start them. They would never happen naturally unless our bodies took some steps to make them do it. And that's going to be the topic of our next presentation tomorrow. How do cells make chemical reactions happen if they have to add this activation energy? Where do they get it from? How does anything happen? Why aren't things reacting all over the place? Tonight, to review what we've talked about so far, work on exercise 5 on pages 56, 57, and 58 of your workbook. You may want to read over sections 5.10 to 5.13 to review this material. And we'll see you for next time.